The next day, after the adventures we had inside the painting, I returned to the shop and immediately sensed something was wrong. There was chaos, shelves overturned, books and artifacts scattered across the floor. Mr. Mortimer wouldn't be back for a couple of days. I started calling for Thomas, but there was no response. Anxiety began to grow. I searched the first floor and then went upstairs, but Thomas was nowhere to be found. My worry intensified. Who could have caused this mess? Could someone have broken in? As I looked around, I noticed light coming from behind a secret door. As I approached, I realized the door was indeed open, but how and who had opened it? I grabbed the edge of the door and opened it wider. Before me was a staircase leading down. Lanterns hung on the walls, casting the light I had seen earlier. They flickered, creating eerie shadows. I descended the staircase and found myself in a wide corridor stretching into the unknown. The corridor was dimly lit by torches on the walls, their flickering light casting long shadows and creating a sinister atmosphere. The floor beneath my feet was paved with ancient stone tiles that creaked and trembled with each step. I moved forward, listening carefully to every sound. The corridor was cold and damp, filled with the smell of mold and mustiness. Occasionally it turned, and at each turn I expected to see something dreadful, but the path remained deserted. Finally, after another turn, the corridor led me into a small room. In the center stood 3 massive chests of different colors, each adorned with carvings and ancient symbols. I stood examining them and noticed that one was slightly ajar. Thoughts raced through my mind. Should I open it or not? Perhaps it was a trap. Where could Thomas be, and who had broken into the shop? I felt cold sweat on my forehead. Inside, a struggle was raging. Should I take the risk and open it, or return upstairs and fetch Yorick? His help could be invaluable in such a situation. But on the other hand, I thought, I could just lift the lid and see what's inside. It won't take long, I told myself, trying to calm down. With a trembling hand, I reached for the chest lid. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my head. Grabbing the edge, I quickly opened it and jumped back, expecting the worst. But nothing happened. The room remained as quiet and silent as before. Approaching again, I peeked inside and saw a girl about my age. It was Eleanor, the same girl who once stole the memory stone and then disappeared. She lay inside, bound by shadows in the form of ropes. How could she fit in there? Perhaps spatial magic was at play. Her face looked puzzled, as if she had tried to escape but couldn't. Strange, I thought. Why do I always meet this girl when she's trapped? I remembered how I first met her, and she was caught by vines. When Eleanor saw me, fear flashed in her eyes, followed by relief. "Please, let me out," she pleaded. I only smiled and asked, "Why should I? After all, this trap was designed for thieves like you." Eleanor pouted indignantly and fell silent. Her reaction amused me, but I knew I had to decide what to do next. Free her and try to get information, or leave her here as punishment for her past crime. In the end, I promised to release her if she told me who she was and what she was doing here. It was clear she was thinking, and then she answered, "Okay, I'll answer your questions, but not all of them. I get to choose what to say or not." "All right," I agreed and asked the first question. "Who are you and who do you work for?" She didn't answer immediately, apparently considering what to say and what not to. "We are called shadow hunters," she began. "We protect people from evil and other dark beings." Sometimes a person encounters trouble without realizing it's the work of dark forces. That's when we intervene. Sometimes monsters attack people and then we come to the rescue. In short, we're the good guys. I stood, pondering her words. I couldn't trust her since she had already deceived me once. Eleanor interrupted my thoughts, saying, "We're the good guys, unlike your employer. Do you know who he really is?" I didn't respond because I wasn't sure myself who he was. "He's a vampire," she said, "and a very powerful one. My superiors start trembling just hearing his name." "I know he's a vampire," I replied. "But that doesn't mean he's bad. While I've worked here, he's always helped those in need." "That's true," she said, "but you don't know his past." "His past?" I asked. "What happened?" "That I won't tell. Who knows? He might get angry at me, and then I wouldn't survive." Her words confused me, and I remembered the old man and his true form as a young vampire. Who was he really? "All right, I'll think about that later," I decided. "Second question, what are you doing here?" "That I can't say," she replied and fell silent as if clamming up. I waited for a while, but she didn't seem to be going to speak. So I sighed and decided to release her. I couldn't just leave her here. I looked for a way to do it and found a small button in the form of a pattern at the back of the chest. Pressing it, the shadows disappeared, and she was ejected out. She landed hard on her backside, then got up, cursing and rubbing the sore spot. After she regained herself, I asked if she had seen a middle-aged man, Thomas. She shook her head but added that she had heard noise before I arrived. "Maybe it was him," she suggested. I scratched my head in puzzlement. What to do? Mr. Mortimer was due back in a couple of days. Should I wait for him? What if something happened to Thomas? Then I decided to check the other chests and wondered which to choose. One was blue, the other red. Eleanor stood by, waiting to see what I would do next. I decided to choose the blue chest. Approaching it, I opened the latch and pressed the button, then jumped back, expecting it to suck me in. But nothing happened. Peeking inside, I saw nothing but an egg lying at the bottom. It was an ordinary chicken egg. What was it for? Mr. Mortimer didn't keep eggs for making omelets here, did he? At first I thought about taking it, but then changed my mind and closed the chest. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Eleanor's eyes light up. That was it, that's what she came for. I wanted to ask her, but decided to check what was in the third chest first. As I approached it, I saw an inscription carved in small letters. Open only in case of emergency. I hesitated. Should I do it? But Thomas was missing, so it was an emergency. So I pressed the button, and before anything happened, I saw Eleanor running towards the chest with the egg. I cursed but couldn't do anything because some force started pulling me into the third chest. Eleanor met the same fate. She didn't make it to her goal before she was also pulled towards me. She screamed as the suction force was strong. I looked around and saw that we were falling into a world that unfolded before us from a bird's eye view. There were castles, forests, and mountains. What was this? Before I could think, I lost consciousness. I woke up with a strange sensation. I was tied to something and couldn't move any limb. My first thought was that I had been sewn to the ground, and horror gripped me. Had someone sewn my skin too? However, looking around, I noticed that only my clothes were sewn and I could move my head. This calmed me down a bit, but I still felt trapped. Looking around, I realized I was lying in the middle of a miniature farm field. Around me were many small creatures resembling gnomes. They were dressed in medieval clothing, tiny tunics, hats, and boots, and their faces expressed a mixture of curiosity and wariness. These gnomes ran around, trying to avoid my gaze. I looked around, hoping to find Eleanor, but she was nowhere to be seen. At that moment, one of the gnomes, the bravest, jumped onto my chest and shouted, "Who are you? Are you an enemy?" His voice was high-pitched but firm, and I felt my heart start racing in surprise. I tried to calm down and respond in a way that wouldn't frighten him any further. "I am not an enemy," I said, trying to speak as gently as possible. "My name is Michael, and I ended up here by accident." The gnome seemed to relax a little, but he still looked at me warily. The rest of his kin approached closer, their small eyes gleaming in the sunlight. I realized I needed to explain more. "We came here from another world. I don't know how it happened, but we need to find our friend Thomas and go home. We won't harm you." The gnome standing on my chest listened attentively, then turned to his companions and said something in their language. They began to converse, discussing my words. "All right, since you say you're good, we will believe you and set you free," said their leader, nodding his head. I was shocked at how trusting they were, believing my words so readily. Suddenly, I saw one of the gnomes climb into the magical pouch I always carried on my belt. It contained magical items, and the problem was that besides the items I put in there myself, it could randomly transport any item from the shop. I wanted to shout for the gnome to get out of there, but he had already managed to pull something out. It was a small glass flute adorned with dragon images. It looked harmless and had one minor effect. As soon as the gnome pulled it out and accidentally blew into it, a small fireball ignited and started slowly rising upwards. All the gnomes, seeing the fire, immediately panicked and scattered to the corners, hiding behind rocks and trees. "What is this?" the chief gnome shouted, his face white with fear. "Fire! It's magic!" As soon as he said that, chaos ensued. The gnomes, gripped by panic, pointed hundreds of miniature swords and spears at me. I felt the tension rise and tried to think quickly about how to resolve the situation when I suddenly heard a shout. "Stop! Quickly free him! He's a friend of the hero!" shouted one of the gnomes, running towards us. I looked at him, not understanding what was happening. But then, I saw a procession of gnomes coming around the corner, carrying Eleanor on a wooden palanquin. She sat on it with a smug look. The chief gnome called out to Eleanor, "Are you really the hero?" She proudly nodded, and the gnomes immediately began to cheer and rejoice. I frowned at her, clearly disapproving of her lying. Then they started to free me. Gradually, I began to feel the freedom in my limbs. When I was completely untied, I sat up, rubbing my stiff arms and legs. "The hero needs to have a word," I said, standing up and gesturing for Eleanor to follow me. I led her away from the enthusiastic crowd of gnomes. "What did you tell them?" I asked with a scolding tone. "Oh, come on, don't you know how this works? These are just diggers. It's always like this with them," Eleanor replied, shrugging. "Diggers?" I asked. "Yes, it seems there was a farm stored in the third chest. They extract mana stones. That's what they're for." "But why were they hidden in the basement?" Eleanor wondered. I looked at these harmless creatures and decided not to ask what kind of stones they were. "How do we get out of here?" I asked the main question. "There should be a teleport somewhere," she said, immediately hurrying to look for it. But I grabbed her hand and said, "First, we need to find Thomas." She didn't want to agree, but then perhaps remembering that I helped her earlier, she nodded. I exhaled in relief. Apparently, she did have a conscience. We approached the gnomes and Eleanor began questioning them about Thomas, but they hadn't seen anything. Only one gnome stepped forward and said he saw a flash near the Swallow Mountains. This was a lead. We were about to head in that direction, but the gnomes began pleading for us to visit their city with them. I wanted to refuse, but seeing their pleading faces, I couldn't say no. We followed the gnomes along a winding path that led us through fields and forests. As we progressed, the landscape changed, and we saw many miniature buildings, carefully integrated into the natural landscape. The path was paved with tiny stones and surrounded by flowers and grasses that looked miniature to us. We passed by little gardens where gnomes were growing their tiny vegetables and fruits. Around us, gnome children ran, playing and laughing, while adults went about their daily chores. Finally, we reached the center of the city. The gnome city was surprisingly beautiful and meticulously planned. In the center was a square paved with tiny stones, surrounded by houses built from wood and stone. These houses were decorated with carvings and flower garlands. In each window, small lights glowed, creating a warm and cozy atmosphere. In the central square, a crowd of residents awaited us. They all looked at us with interest, whispering and smiling. The chief gnome climbed onto a small platform and raised his hand, calling for silence. "The heroes have come to us in a difficult time," he began, "when our kingdom needs help." Eleanor and I listened attentively, trying to understand what trials lay ahead of us. "Evil has come to our minds, and this hero and her assistant will save us from this trouble. Let us support them," said the elder. Applause erupted around us. "Well, now we have to help them," Eleanor began to whine. We could have just left. She closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose as if everything annoyed her. "And does this girl really work in an organization that helps people?" "It doesn't seem like it," I thought, looking at her. In the meantime, the celebration began. The gnomes brought us a pot filled with blue stones, which were beautiful and seemed to be flowing with energy. Seeing the reward, Eleanor's eyes bulged and she almost drooled. "What kind of reaction is that?" I thought. "These stones must be very valuable." Without hesitation, she jumped up and shouted, "Why didn't you say there was a reward? Show us the way." The gnomes bustled, preparing for the expedition. Soon several gnomes approached us with torches and small shields. They led us along a winding path that stretched through a dense forest. It was shrouded in magic, and every tree seemed to whisper in its own language. The torchlight cast bizarre shadows, making the surroundings even more mysterious. Along the way, the gnomes told us about the mine and the evil that had filled it. They spoke of creatures that appeared suddenly and began to destroy everything around. Their descriptions were full of horror and fear. We crossed a wooden bridge over a small stream, and soon approached the entrance. It was guarded by several gnomes with spears and bows. When they saw us, their faces lit up, and they began to open the gates. "Here is the mine," said the chief gnome. "Be careful inside. We believe you can drive out the evil and restore peace to us." Hearing this pompous speech, Eleanor just snorted and headed forward. The mine looked impressive. It had high ceilings, reaching up to 3 human heights, and the tunnels extended deep into the ground. Everywhere on the walls, blue mana crystals shimmered, emitting a soft glow that illuminated our path. These crystals were incredibly beautiful. Their light refracted and reflected, creating amazing patterns on the stone walls. But among these crystals were also blood crystals, their ominous red light standing out against the blue. This must have been the contamination the gnomes had mentioned. These blood crystals emitted a strange sense of unease, and every time we passed by them, I felt a chill run down my spine. We continued constantly looking around and expecting an attack, but nothing happened. The silence and unusual emptiness of the mine only heightened our tension. It was a good thing the path was lit by the crystals on the walls. Otherwise, we would have gotten lost in these endless labyrinths a long time ago. Suddenly we heard a rustling sound, the noise of something scurrying. We froze, expecting anything. Out of the darkness ahead, shapes began to appear. At first, they were barely visible, but gradually we realized they were gnomes. However, they looked different. Their eyes were empty, and their movements slow and uncoordinated. I realized these were zombie gnomes, a horrifying sight. Hundreds of small figures, devoid of consciousness, were moving towards us, surrounding us. Their faces were twisted in mad grimaces, and their clothes torn and dirty. I was at a loss, trying to decide what to do. I ran through the items I had previously put in my bag, but nothing useful came to mind. So I decided to rely on luck and stuck my hand into the compartment where random items from the shop would appear. I started feeling around the bag's contents and suddenly felt something square. Pulling out the item, I realized it was a Rubik's Cube. "Okay, think, what could this be?" I muttered, holding my temples and closing my eyes. Right? Depending on the combination, it caused various effects. But damn it, I didn't remember those combinations and would have to act randomly. Making a few twists of the cube's faces, I solved the yellow side. At that moment, this face glowed, and I directed the cube towards the zombie gnomes. There was a flash. The zombies turned into small, harmless toys that continued to move towards us. "Great," I swore. "Toys." Eleanor, apparently realizing nothing good had come of it, shouted, "Run!" We dashed forward, weaving through the crowd of toy zombies, which now looked less threatening but still pursued us. Eventually, we managed to lose them, but then shadows started rushing toward us. Eleanor stepped forward and pulled out a staff. The staff was long and slender, with a silver tip adorned with magical runes glowing in the dim light of the mine. Waving it, she said something in an ancient language, and the staff lit up brightly. The shadows, as if struck, began to dissipate, and soon disappeared entirely, leaving us in safety. "Onward!" Eleanor shouted, and we ran further. Ahead we saw a red crystal that pulsed as if alive, radiating a sinister energy. Running up to it, I felt the darkness emanating from it seeping into me. The dark energy was strong, and I started feeling unwell. The staff Eleanor held helped weaken the darkness's influence, but it was still hard. I rushed forward and grabbed the crystal. Wild pain shot through me, and I felt the energy flowing through me, trying to take control. I began to see various visions. Meister Mortimer, a war, blood, screams, and then Thomas, who was caught in a trap. I tried to snap out of it. Gritting my teeth, I fought through it and tossed the crystal into my bag. In that instant, the atmosphere changed, the darkness disappeared, and I collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Eleanor ran to me, kneeling down. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I was breathing heavily, but felt my strength gradually returning. "Yes," I replied with difficulty. What did those visions mean, and what was that crystal? I was shaking, but slowly recovering. We needed to hurry, Thomas was in danger. Finally, I managed to stand, and we headed toward the exit. Along the way, we saw gnome bodies lying everywhere. Apparently, the evil spell had been broken, just like mine. I felt sorry for them, but there was nothing more we could do. When we emerged outside, joyful gnomes greeted us, sensing that we had completed the task. They welcomed us as heroes, their faces glowing with gratitude and relief. Soon we returned to the city, where we were given our reward amid the cheerful applause of the locals. Eleanor grabbed the pot containing the blue manna stones and said, "We'll split it in half." I didn't argue and received my share, which I immediately threw into my bag. Shortly after, we asked the gnomes to lead us to the Swallow Mountains, the only clue to where Thomas might be. Time was running out, and we needed to hurry. Understanding the urgency of our request, the gnomes quickly found guides. We left the city and re-entered the forest, heading towards our goal. The journey didn't take long. As we approached the mountain, we felt some malevolent energy, but encountered no immediate danger. We followed a path that led us to a cave. At the entrance stood enormous gates. They were made of black stone, adorned with intricate carvings and symbols that glowed with a dim red light. They looked ancient and ominous, as if guarding something important and dangerous. The surface of the gates depicted scenes of battles and magical rituals, with a large round emblem at the center. The gates were locked, and we stood there, pondering how to get inside. Carefully examining them, I noticed 3 indentations, their shape reminding me of something. Right, they had the same shape as the red stone I had found earlier. I cursed, realizing we needed to find 2 more like it to open the gates. Eleanor and I exchanged glances and then looked at our gnome guides. "Do you know where we can find more of that malevolent energy?" I asked them, expecting a negative response. To my surprise, the gnomes nodded. "Yes, we know," one of them replied. "They are far from our city, so they don't pose a threat to us." I asked them to take us there. The gnomes agreed and led us again through the forest to a lake. When we reached it, it looked eerie and mystical. The water was dark and calm, like a mirror reflecting the gray sky and surrounding trees. Ancient, gnarled trees grew around it, their roots protruding from the ground, forming intricate patterns. On the shore stood large boulders covered in moss and lichen. Fog swirled above the water's surface, giving the lake a sinister appearance. In the center of the lake was an island with an ancient altar surrounded by magical symbols. This place emitted the same malevolent energy we had felt before. "The water here is cursed," one of the gnomes said. "We never go near this place." I scratched my head, thinking. So, we needed to get to that island. Luckily, I had something to help overcome obstacles. Searching in my bag, I pulled out a coil of wire. Eleanor looked at me skeptically. "What's that?" she asked. "You'll see," I replied, unwinding the coil and saying a code phrase. Suddenly, the wire began to extend, intertwining to form a web-like structure. In a moment, a bridge made of wire stretched towards the island. Its thin, interwoven lines formed a pattern resembling a spider web. It looked fragile, but I stepped on it and jumped. The bridge even had handrails. We headed towards the island where the stone lay. The bridge swayed and bent under our steps, but I quickly got used to it and walked confidently, remembering that the stone was likely guarded by those shadows. Eleanor already had her staff ready. Suddenly, we saw ripples on the calm water. I realized we wouldn't pass through here easily. Just as I thought this, enormous crayfish the size of dogs leapt out of the water. They too seemed to be zombies, with white pupils. Clacking their claws, they climbed onto the bridge. I dodged one jumping towards me, and we ran. Suddenly, one of them jumped onto the bridge right in front of us, nearly hitting me with its claw. In panic, I backed away and reached for the Rubik's Cube. I began twisting the faces quickly, trying to find the right color. The cube activated only when at least one side was solved. But understand, when a giant creature is crawling towards you, wanting to cut your head off with its claw, it's hard to do. Finally, I solved the green side. The face of the cube lit up and I directed a beam of light at the crayfish. There was a flash, and it started growing larger. "Damn it!" I cursed at my bad luck. Will this thing's weight break the bridge? But the bridge held. The crayfish had grown to the size of a bulldozer. In a panic, I continued to twist the cube's faces. Eleanor screamed as the enormous claw moved towards us. Finally, I solved the blue side. I aimed the beam at the monster, and there was a flash. The entire area turned to ice. The giant crayfish froze, becoming an ice statue. We sighed in relief, realizing the danger had passed. The ice around us creaked and cracked, but the bridge remained intact. We hurried on, aiming to reach the island as quickly as possible. On the island, we were met by an ancient altar covered in magical symbols. In its center lay the second red crystal, pulsating with sinister energy. Shadows began to gather around us, but Eleanor's staff kept them at bay, creating a bright aura around us. I rushed forward and grabbed the stone, once again feeling the familiar pain and seeing visions. I saw Mr. Mortimer in his vampire form. He stood amid the Egyptian pyramids with a beautiful woman next to him. Could that be Cleopatra? I thought. Then the scene changed, and I saw a battlefield with a man standing. I recognized him. It was Napoleon Bonaparte. The image shifted again, and I saw blood and heard screams. I screamed and shoved the stone into my bag, trying to rid myself of the torturous visions. I was back on the island. The shadows had dispersed. I collapsed to the ground, trying to recover. Eleanor stood nearby, biting her lower lip in concern. She then helped me up, and we crossed the bridge. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice full of worry. "Yeah, I think so," I replied, trying to calm down. I recited a spell and the bridge coiled back into a roll. I threw it into my bag and we hurried on. The gnomes waiting for us sighed in relief, seeing us safe and sound. Now that we had the second stone, we needed to find the last one to open the cave gates. We quickly explained to the gnomes what had happened and asked them to take us to the last place where we could find another crystal. We walked through the forest again and headed towards the canyons. It was a beautiful place. The canyon stretched far ahead, its rocky walls covered with sparse shrubs and flowers, and below, a swift river flowed, sparkling in the sun. The steep slopes created breathtaking views, with majestic rock formations towering above us, creating incredible patterns. When we arrived at the location, I saw a strange sight in the distance. Enormous boulders moving around. Upon closer inspection, I realized they were golems, but Eleanor corrected me, saying they were stone trolls. I looked closer and saw their hideous faces. Rough features, huge twisted mouths, and empty eye sockets radiating malice. They walked around a pedestal on which I saw the stone we needed. This was our third task, and it was no easier than the previous ones. I turned to Eleanor and asked if she had any ideas. Then she said, "You have the cube." I wanted to argue. "You saw that it has random effects, and it can be dangerous. Do you have any other option?" She shook her head, so I had no choice but to use it. There were 3 colors left: white, orange, and red. I didn't go for orange, assuming it might be fire-related and fire wouldn't help against stone creatures. That left white and red. I leaned towards red. We sneaked closer, and I started twisting the faces until I solved the red side. Suddenly, an idea came to me. What if I solved 2 or more colors at once? I decided to take a risk and added yellow. The cube glowed. Light poured from two faces. I panicked, fearing it might affect me, and threw it towards the trolls. There was a flash of light, and the stone trolls, who had started converging on the cube, turned into leather sofas. It was so astonishing that Eleanor stood in shock, her mouth open. I was amazed myself, not expecting such an effect. But it worked to our advantage. I ran to the cube, picked it up, and headed for the altar. We couldn't waste any time. Grabbing the stone, I again saw a vision and felt pain. This time, the visions were more blurred. I saw a group of people and recognized the moment. It was the signing of the U.S. Constitution. Among them, I saw Mr. Mortimer, not in vampire form, but as an old man. The image changed, and I saw a woman's face, blurred. I felt fear. Then the scene changed again, showing a war with people shooting, bombs exploding, blood and screams. I fought through it and put the stone in my bag, then tried to catch my breath. This time my strength didn't leave me, and I could stand. "Great job!" Eleanor praised me. We headed back towards the cave. When we arrived at the gates, I took a deep breath and concentrated, then quickly placed the stones in the slots. I felt a slight pain, but it was bearable. The stones glowed with a bright, ominous light, bathing everything around in a red glow. The symbols on the gates began to pulse in sync with the stones, emitting mystical energy. The gates shuddered, and the ancient magical runes on their surface shone even brighter. With a loud creak and rumble, the gates began to slowly open, revealing the entrance to a vast cave. We stepped inside and felt the cool air envelop us. The cave was enormous, with high arches lost in the darkness. The walls were covered in shimmering crystals, reflecting the light of our torches. We walked forward, and the echo of our footsteps reverberated everywhere. The path was winding and mysterious. Occasionally, we encountered strange symbols and drawings on the walls, depicting ancient battles and magical rituals. Eleanor held her staff at the ready, her gaze alert. We walked slowly, carefully examining every corner. The deeper we went, the stronger the sense of something sinister became. Soon we reached a large hall. In the center stood a massive altar, on which lay a crystal red heart on a pedestal. It was alive and beating, emitting a sinister aura. Next to it stood a huge glass cube containing Thomas. He was in his werewolf form, fighting someone inside. We cautiously approached and saw his opponent. He was dressed in black clothes embroidered with blood-red patterns, his head hidden under a hood, and his face covered by a white mask with no facial features, just a smooth surface like a mannequin. This person reminded me of a ninja or villains from movies working for dark organizations. We approached the cube, trying to figure out how to free Thomas. Eleanor's staff had no effect on it. So we started searching the hall for clues, but found nothing. I cursed myself for not bringing Yorick. He would have known what to do. I took out the Rubik's Cube and started examining it. There were still a few colors left. I thought about the white side, possibly linked to white magic, although on the other hand, it could do anything. I feared turning Thomas into a sofa, but had no choice. Twisting the faces, I solved the white side. The cube glowed and a beam of light shot out. I aimed it at the crystal, and miraculously, it began to melt. Could it really be working? It took a little time, and soon Thomas started to move. But so did the unknown man. When the crystal melted completely, he leapt aside, and Thomas roared and lunged at him. I realized something was wrong. "Eleanor, did you go straight to the basement or search the shop first?" I asked, recounting the mess that had been made there. She shook her head. "No, I went straight to the basement. Then I realized another person had broken into the shop, and it was this man who had followed the girl. Apparently, Thomas discovered him and chased him, ending up in this place. Now they were fighting each other, but suddenly the man dashed to the altar and grabbed the heart. At that moment, there was an unexpected surge of energy, and the heart began to glow brightly. Realizing the danger, Thomas rushed toward him, but the stranger managed to activate some spell. "Careful!" Eleanor shouted, raising her staff. The man looked at us with a wicked smile. "Too late," he said in a sinister voice. He began to grow, and thick red smoke swirled around him. He transformed and changed until he turned into the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She had sharp fangs, and I realized she was a vampire. Her body seemed ethereal, like a genie from a lamp. Her legs were hidden in the smoke, and she appeared to float above the ground. She started looking around, trying to understand what had happened. Then, seeing Thomas running toward her, the vampire said something. At that moment, Thomas was thrown against the wall, hitting it hard and losing consciousness. It seemed we were in big trouble. Looking closely at this woman, I remembered seeing her in the visions when I touched the blood crystals. Her face had been blurred, but from the image, I guessed it was her. Having dealt with the werewolf, she looked at us cunningly and smiled, saying something in an unknown language. I suddenly felt an overwhelming desire to become her servant. I tried to fight the spell, but I couldn't. Suddenly, Eleanor shoved me on the shoulder, shouting, "Snap out of it!" This cleared my mind, and I tried to avoid looking at the vampire. "What should we do?" I shouted, seeing from Eleanor's eyes that she didn't know either. I handed her the Rubik's Cube. "Solve all the sides," I shouted. Then I pulled a slinky toy from my bag and tossed it on the floor. It started bouncing and jumping around the cave, catching the vampire's attention. To my surprise, she was distracted by it, giving us some time. But this didn't last long. The woman realized we were trying to deceive her, and with a snap of her fingers, she turned the toy to dust. Her gaze filled with rage, and she raised her hand, ready to attack. I thought this was the end for us, and glanced at Eleanor. To my surprise, she had almost solved the cube. Everything happened in slow motion. The vampire's hand came down, and she was saying something, but Eleanor shouted, "Done!" The cube lit up with multicolored lights like a disco ball, and she threw it toward the vampire. There was a bright flash of light that knocked us back. I heard a terrible roar, then lost consciousness. I woke up and realized we were in the basement, next to the chests. Eleanor sat nearby, Thomas had returned to his human form, and the ninja-like man was lying unconscious. The first thought that came to my mind was, who was that vampire? She seemed to be connected to Meister Mortimer somehow. But why was she imprisoned in this chest? All these questions ran through my mind, but my thoughts were interrupted by Eleanor, who nudged me and told me to get up. I glanced at Thomas and asked if he was okay. He nodded, thanking us, and told us what had happened. He had been sleeping upstairs when he heard noise from below. Rushing down, he found an intruder breaking into the basement. Thomas chased him but couldn't stop him. The intruder opened the chest, and they were both sucked inside. They ended up in the cave and started fighting, but some force froze them. I thought it might have been a trap set by someone. Now I understood the situation. But who was this unknown man? I asked Eleanor, and she replied, "He's a faceless." "Who are they?" I asked, surprised. But she didn't have time to answer, as we heard a rustling sound nearby. Turning, I saw light coming from the blue chest where the egg lay. Eleanor's face turned pale. "Not this," she said. The chest's lid flew open, and we saw the egg trembling, surrounded by a blue light. The sound of cracking shells was loud, like someone smashing walls. Cracks appeared on the egg, and it broke open, revealing the creature inside. Looking at it, I cursed, saying, "Damn it, more problems for us."